hidden inside a carefully controlled archive at Yale University, protected behind glass and treated almost like an object from another world, rests a book that no one has ever been able to understand. Not historians, not language experts, not even codebreakers whose predecessors defeated Germany's Enigma system during the Second World War. Not even today's most advanced artificial intelligence. Its roughly 240 vellum pages are covered in graceful, unfamiliar writing, surrounded by drawings of bizarre plants that seem to belong nowhere in the natural world, astronomical diagrams that match no recognized system, and page after page of unclothed women immersed in green-colored pools, connected by strange tubes and almost biological plumbing. It is known as the Voinich Manuscript, and since appearing again in 1912, it has defeated more than a century of attempts to explain it. Consider how unusual that is. We have deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs. We have translated cuneiform tablets far older than this manuscript. We have broken military codes intentionally created to remain impossible to solve. But this one manuscript, written by an unknown hand for an unknown purpose in an unknown script, has outlasted every codering technique humanity has thrown at it. Radiocarbon dating tells us the vellum is real, physically dated to the early 1400s. The ink is period accurate. This isn't some flimsy modern forgery. Whatever this thing is, it's old and it's genuine. So, what exactly are we looking at? Is it a cipher? Some encrypted version of a known language hiding behind a curtain of symbols? Is it a lost language entirely? A tongue that vanished from history along with the people who spoke it? Is it an invented system? Something like a constructed language dreamed up centuries before Tolkien ever created Elvish? Or is it something stranger? Something that doesn't fit neatly into any of our existing categories at all? These are the questions that have consumed cryptographers, historians, botanists, and obsessive amateurs for over a century, and nobody has an answer that everyone agrees on. Now, here's where things get really interesting, and where this video is going to take you somewhere most Voynich content never goes. There's a theory floating around, fringe, unproven, but genuinely fascinating, that this manuscript might not just be a medieval curiosity. Some researchers and independent thinkers have proposed that the Voynich manuscript could be a copy, or a copy of something far older, possibly a fragment of pre-flood knowledge. Ancient scientific understanding that predates recorded history as we know it, preserved and passed down in a form nobody today can decipher. I want to be clear, this isn't an established fact, it's a theory, but it's one worth examining carefully, because the evidence trail we're about to walk through, the dating, the origins, the script itself, the impossible botanical illustrations, the astronomical diagrams, the anatomical drawings, all of it leaves just enough room for genuine wonder. Over the next several minutes, we're going to dig into every layer of this mystery. Where the book came from, who owned it, what the script actually looks like, and whether it behaves like real language at all, what those plants might represent, why the astronomy doesn't match anything we know, and why, even with modern computers and artificial intelligence throwing everything they've got at this thing, it remains completely, stubbornly, unread. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from right now and what time it is there. I love seeing these roll in from all over the world, and if you want to support the channel, the best way is by following the show on Spotify and leaving a 5-star review. There's a link in the description below. Now, let's open this book that no one can read. Let's start with the basics, because before we get lost in theories about lost civilizations and pre-flood science, we need to understand exactly what physical object we're actually dealing with. Officially, it's called Bicky MS-48. That's the catalog number Yale University's Bicky Rare Book and Manuscript Library uses to identify it. Tucked in among thousands of other rare texts, but treated with a level of security most of those other books never get. It's not just old, it's famous for being unreadable, and that fame has turned it into one of the most photographed, most digitized, most obsessively studied objects in the entire library. Physically, It's smaller than most people expect. This isn't some massive tome you'd need 2 hands to lift. It's roughly the size of a modern paperback novel, about 23 centimeters by 16 centimeters. Small enough to carry, small enough to hide, small enough that whoever made it clearly intended it to be portable. The pages are vellum, which means treated animal skin, most likely cow skin, the standard writing material of medieval Europe before paper became common. That detail matters because vellum can be scientifically dated, and it holds up remarkably well over centuries when stored properly. It's part of the reason this manuscript has survived at all. As it exists today, the manuscript contains about 240 pages, though scholars typically describe it in folios since many of the sheets fold out into much larger illustrations. And here's the thing that should immediately raise your curiosity. There's strong evidence the book used to be bigger. The page numbering, which appears to have been added sometime after the original writing, has gaps. Folios are missing. Nobody knows if those pages were lost to accident, deliberately removed, or stolen by a collector somewhere along the centuries-long chain of ownership. Whatever the original book contained, we're not looking at the complete picture. We're looking at what survived. Now, every single page is covered in flowing, confident handwriting in a script nobody recognizes, accompanied by colored illustrations that range from strange to genuinely bizarre. And this is where the manuscript starts organizing itself into distinct sections, even though nobody agrees on what those sections actually mean. There's a large portion dedicated to plants, page after page of botanical drawings, roots, stems, leaves, flowers rendered in careful detail with color washes of green, red, and blue. Researchers call this the herbal section, and we're going to spend real time on it later because these plants have a problem. Many of them don't match anything found in nature. There's a section filled with circular diagrams, wheels within wheels covered in symbols, stars, and what look like zodiac figures. Scholars call this the astronomical or astrological section, and it behaves nothing like the star charts European astronomers were producing at the time. There's a section that features dozens of small nude female figures, often shown standing or sitting in pools connected by an elaborate network of tubes and vessels that look almost anatomical, almost mechanical. This is usually called the biological section, though that name is doing a lot of guessing. There's a pharmaceutical section showing labeled jars, containers, and isolated plant parts, roots, and leaves drawn separately from their full plant illustrations elsewhere in the book, as if someone were cataloging ingredients rather than describing whole organisms. And finally, there are pages of dense, unillustrated text, packed line after line with the manuscript's mysterious script, often called the recipes section, because of how the text is broken into short paragraph-like blocks, each one marked with a small symbol, almost like a bullet point or a star, similar to how a real recipe book might separate individual entries. Now, here's an important distinction we need to make right at the start, because it's easy to blur the line between the object and the claims people make about it. The manuscript itself, the physical vellum, the ink, the binding, the illustrations, that part is not mysterious in the sense of being impossible. Medieval Europe absolutely had the technology, the materials, and the skilled scribes capable of producing something like this. Illustrated herbals existed. Astrological diagrams existed. Books blending science, medicine, and mysticism were common among scholars, physicians, and alchemists of the era. What's mysterious is the content, the script that doesn't match any known language, the plants that don't exist, the astronomy that follows no known system. The manuscript as an object is strange, but not physically impossible for its time period. It's what's written and drawn inside it that has kept historians, cryptographers, and increasingly artificial intelligence researchers awake at night for over 100 years. So, now that we know what we're actually holding, let's find out how this thing found its way into the modern world in the first place. And that brings us to 1912. The moment this strange little book stepped out of the shadows and into the modern world. The man who found it was Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish-born rare book dealer with an instinct for manuscripts that other people had overlooked. Voynich wasn't an academic sitting in a university archive. He was a hunter. He traveled Europe, buying old books, private libraries, forgotten documents, anything that might have slipped through the cracks of history. And in 1912, while negotiating the purchase of a group of manuscripts from a Jesuit institution in Italy, he came across the book that would eventually carry his name. The place was Villa Mandreon, a huge 16th century estate in the hills outside Rome near Frascati. It had once belonged to popes and aristocrats. By the early 20th century, it was being used by the Jesuits as a college, and somewhere inside its collections, among old theological texts, scientific works, letters, and manuscripts accumulated across centuries, sat this little vellum volume, covered in unknown writing. Imagine finding it. You open a medieval book expecting Latin, maybe Greek, maybe a familiar European language written in an unfamiliar hand. Instead, every line is filled with symbols you cannot read. Strange loops, hooks, gallows-shaped characters, repeating clusters that look structured enough to be language, but alien enough to be something else entirely. Then you turn the page and find plants that don't seem to belong to any known botanical tradition. Naked women floating in green liquid, wheels, stars, pipes, jars, castles, diagrams. For a rare book dealer, this wasn't just unusual, this was treasure. Voynich acquired the manuscript as part of a larger purchase. The exact terms of that sale are not completely clear, partly because the Jesuits wanted discretion. Religious institutions often had historic collections, but limited money. Selling rare books could bring in funds, but publicly admitting you were selling cultural treasures was not always good for the institution's reputation, so Voynich did not immediately announce every detail. For years, even the location where he had obtained the manuscript was treated cautiously. But the Villa Mandreoni connection is now well established. The manuscript had emerged from a Jesuit collection, and that matters because it gives us the first solid bridge between the book's mysterious past and its documented modern history. Not its complete past, just a bridge, because when Voynich opened a manuscript, he found something incredibly important tucked inside it. A letter dated 1665 written in Latin by a Bohemian scholar named Johannes Marcus Marci. Marci was sending the book to Athanasius Kircher, one of the most famous intellectuals in Europe at the time. Kircher was a Jesuit priest, a polymath, and a man with a reputation so enormous that people mailed him questions from across the continent. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, Chinese language, volcanoes, fossils, secret codes, lost knowledge. Kircher had opinions about all of it. Many of those opinions turned out to be wrong. But in the 17th century, if you had an undeciphered text and wanted somebody brilliant to look at it, Kircher was exactly the kind of person you would contact. Marci's letter says the manuscript had previously belonged to a man named Georg Beers, another scholar from Prague. Beers had apparently spent years staring at the book, trying to understand it, and finally sent samples of its writing to Kircher, hoping the great decoder could help. Kircher either could not solve it, would not solve it, or perhaps never seriously tried. We don't know, but after Barish died, Marci inherited the manuscript and eventually sent the entire thing to Rome. That letter is one of the most important pieces of evidence in the whole Voynich story. It proves the book existed in the 17th century. It connects it to real people. It establishes that the manuscript was already unreadable to scholars nearly 350 years ago. And it shows that its mystery did not begin with Wilfrid Voynich trying to sell it. The letter also includes a much more dramatic claim. Marci wrote that he had heard the manuscript once belonged to Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, the ruler of Prague, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Supposedly, Rudolf paid 600 gold ducats for it, an enormous amount of money, because he believed it was the work of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar often remembered as a kind of medieval scientific genius. Now, this is where we have to slow down. Marci did not say he had personally watched Rudolf buy the manuscript. He said he had heard that story, and stories attached to rare books have a way of getting more valuable every time they are repeated. Rudolf Deakin did collect art, astrology, alchemy, scientific instruments, strange animals, and unusual manuscripts. His court in Prague was one of the great centers of esoteric learning in Europe. So the story is possible, but possible is not the same thing as proven. There is, however, another clue pointing toward Prague. On the first page of the manuscript, researchers identified what appears to be the faded signature of Jacobus Hortikidenik. He was a court official, physician, and pharmacist, associated with Rudolf II. If that signature is genuine, it suggests the book really did pass through Rudolf's circle. But the ink is faint, the evidence is complicated, and even that would not prove the emperor himself bought it for 600 ducats. This is the pattern we keep running into. A trail of evidence, then fog, a name, then a gap, a letter, then a rumor. We can trace the manuscript with reasonable confidence from Bears in Prague to Marci to Kircher in Rome. We know Kircher's books and papers eventually became part of the collections held by the Jesuits. We know the manuscript later surfaced at Villa Mondrian. Then, in 1912, Wilfrid Voynich bought it. But between the manuscript's creation in the 15th century and its appearance in 17th century Prague, there is a long silence, and even the route from Kircher's Roman collection to the Village on sale is not documented page by page, like a modern museum record. That silence is exactly where speculation rushes in. Was it hidden during wars, passed through private hands, forgotten in a Jesuit archive for centuries, taken from one library and quietly transferred to another? We can propose possibilities. We cannot simply turn them into facts. Voynich, though, understood something important. The manuscript did not need to be solved to become famous. It just needed to be presented as a historic mystery, and he knew how to present it. He began showing it to scholars, collectors, cryptographers, and journalists. He circulated photographs. He promoted the possibility that it might be Roger Bacon's lost work, a coded scientific text centuries ahead of its time. But Bacon theory was never established, but it was irresistible. If the book had truly been written by Bacon, then the strange script might conceal advanced science, forbidden knowledge, perhaps discoveries too dangerous or too revolutionary to state openly. But the early 20th century had seen cryptography become a serious tool of war and espionage. Codes were no longer just the hobby of eccentric scholars. They could decide battles, expose spies, and protect governments. A manuscript that looked like an unsolved cipher from the Middle Ages was exactly the kind of object people wanted to believe contained a hidden message. Voynich had found the perfect mystery for the modern age. After Wilfrid Voynich died in 1930, the manuscript passed to his wife, Ethel Voynich. She was a remarkable figure in her own right, best known as the author of the novel The Gadfly. For decades, she kept the manuscript while its reputation continued growing. Experts tried languages, ciphers, shorthand systems, artificial alphabets, and elaborate theories of concealment. Nobody produced a solution that convinced everyone else. When Ethel died in 1960, the manuscript was inherited by her longtime associate, Anne Nill. The following year, Nill sold it to another legendary rare book dealer, H.P. Krauss, for $24,500. Krauss snorts, believed the manuscript might be worth far more. He offered it for sale at $160,000, a staggering price at the time. But no buyer appeared. Maybe collectors were nervous about paying a fortune for a book nobody could read. Maybe its fame had made it too weird even for wealthy bibliophiles. Or maybe the fact that nobody could prove what it said made the manuscript impossible to value. So in 1969, Krauss donated it to Yale University. Yale placed it in the Bickey Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where it received the catalog number MS48. And that is why this thing isn't locked in a private vault today. It is preserved, photographed, digitized, and available for researchers around the world to examine. The book that vanished into archives for centuries is now one of the most accessible, mysterious manuscripts on Earth. But access has not brought an answer. If anything, it has made the mystery bigger because now we know where it came from in the modern era. We know some of the hands that held it. We know the stories attached to it. What we still don't know is the one thing everyone wants to know. Who made it? What language is it written in? And why did someone go to such extraordinary trouble to make a book nobody has ever been able to read? So we can trace the Voynich Manuscript back to 17th century Prague. We can follow it into the Jesuit collections in Rome. We can watch it reappear in 1912 in the hands of Wilfrid Voynich. But that still leaves the biggest gap of all. When was this thing actually made? For decades, people argued from style. Some thought the illustrations looked medieval. Others saw Renaissance influences. Some believers in the Roger Bacon theory wanted it to be 13th century. Others suggested it was a 16th century fake designed to impress Emperor Rudolph II. The dates moved around depending on the theory. If you thought it was Bacon, it had to be old. If you thought it was a sophisticated hoax, it could be newer. If you thought it contained lost ancient knowledge, maybe it was a copy of something far older than the book itself. Then in 2009, the manuscript was tested using radiocarbon dating, and the result was one of the clearest facts we have about the Voynich Manuscript. Researchers took tiny samples from 4 different pieces of its vellum. Not giant chunks, not pages ripped apart, just minuscule fragments carefully selected from the edges of the parchment. Those samples were sent to the University of Arizona's Accelerator Mass Spectrometry Laboratory, one of the leading facilities for this kind of testing. The results placed the production of the vellum between about 1404 and 1438, with a 95% confidence range. That means the animal skins used to make the manuscript's pages came from the early 15th century, not ancient Egypt, not the time of Roger Bacon, not a 19th century invention by Wilfrid Voynich. The physical pages are medieval, produced during the late Middle Ages at a moment when Europe was emerging from plague, war, religious conflict, and massive social change. Think about what that means. When these skins were being prepared into parchment, the 100 Years' War was still raging between England and France. The Ottoman Empire was expanding. The printing press had not yet transformed Europe. Most books were still copied by hand, page by page, by scribes using ink, quills, and unbelievable patience. Universities existed. Monasteries preserved libraries. Physicians consulted ancient Greek and Arabic authorities. Astrologers advised princes, and alchemists searched for secrets hidden in nature. This was a world that could absolutely produce a strange manuscript full of medicinal plants, astronomical diagrams, bathing figures, and coded-looking writing. But there is an important catch. Radiocarbon dating does not date the moment somebody wrote the text. It dates the organic material being tested. In this case, vellum. Vellum is made from animal skin, usually calf, sheep, or goat. While the animal is alive, its body absorbs carbon from the environment. After it dies, that carbon begins changing at a predictable rate. By measuring the remaining radioactive carbon, scientists can estimate when the animal died. So the test tells us when the animals supplying the parchment were alive. It tells us approximately when those skins became available to be made into writing material. It does not tell us the exact day the manuscript was written. It does not reveal the name of the person holding the quill. It cannot identify the language, and it cannot tell us whether the strange words on the page were copied from an older source, invented on the spot, or deliberately concealed. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Imagine finding a modern notebook containing a handwritten copy of a Roman poem. The paper would date to today. The poem could date to 2,000 years ago. The physical object and the intellectual content are not necessarily the same age. The Voynich Manuscript could be a 15th century book containing ideas from an earlier tradition. It could be a copy of a lost text. It could be a compilation of medieval material from several sources. Or it could be entirely original to the person or people who created it. The carbon test narrows the age of the artifact. It does not solve the origin of its knowledge. And naturally, the mystery has one possible escape hatch. Old parchment could theoretically be reused. Parchment was expensive, making it required animal skins, labor, specialized preparation, stretching, scraping, drying, and cutting. In some cases, medieval scribes recycled older manuscripts. They scraped or washed away the original writing and wrote something new over it. These recycled pages are called palimpsests. With modern imaging, scholars can sometimes recover the erased text underneath. So, could someone have obtained parchment that was already decades or even centuries old, then written the Voynich manuscript much later? In theory, yes, a person in the 16th century could have used 15th century parchment. A later hoaxer could have acquired old blank pages. The radiocarbon date alone cannot make that physically impossible. But theory is not evidence. The manuscript is not just a random stack of old leaves with strange writing added later. Its pages were arranged into planned gatherings known as quires. The writing, drawings, page layouts, and fold-out sections appear integrated into the construction of the book. The parchment samples from different areas all point to the same early 15th century period. There is no solid evidence that somebody assembled a large supply of century-old blank vellum simply to create an elaborate mystery at a later date. Could it have happened? Yes. Do we have evidence that it happened? No. And that is the responsible line to hold. Possibility is not proof. Other features of the manuscript point in the same general direction. The ink, pigments, handwriting, page design, and artistic conventions have all been examined by specialists. None of them has delivered a magic answer, but together they make the 15th century setting look increasingly plausible. The paints appear consistent with materials available to medieval artists. The manuscript uses colors made from mineral and plant-based pigments: greens, blues, reds, yellows, browns. Analysis has not revealed some obvious modern chemical signature that would expose it as a recent fabrication. That does not tell us where every pigment came from or exactly when every stroke was applied. But it means the materials do not scream 19th century forgery. The handwriting matters too, or rather the handwriting of the script's individual symbols. Voynich is not Latin, and nobody has convincingly identified it as any known language. But the way the characters are formed, the way the lines move across the page, and the overall habits of the scribal hands look compatible with late medieval manuscript culture. Researchers have even argued that more than one person may have contributed to the text and illustrations. That is exactly what you might expect from a serious manuscript project. One person writing, another drawing, someone else adding paint, labels, corrections, or additional pages. Medieval books were often collaborative objects. They were not always the work of one isolated genius in one locked room. The binding is more complicated. Books get repaired, covers wear out, threads break, owners rebind valuable manuscripts. The Voynich manuscript's current binding cannot simply be treated as a perfect time capsule from the day the book was made. But its physical construction, especially the way its parchment gatherings were prepared and organized, supports the idea that the manuscript originated as a planned 15th century object, not as a few mysterious pages thrown together long afterward. And the illustrations fit that broad era too. Not perfectly, not comfortably. That is part of the problem. The plants look unlike ordinary European herbals, but herbals were copied, adapted, stylized, and sometimes badly misunderstood for centuries. The circular diagrams resemble traditions of astronomy, astrology, cosmology, and medical theory found throughout medieval Europe. The bathing women and strange pipes may look bizarre to modern eyes, but medieval art was full of symbolic bodies, allegorical landscapes, cosmic systems, and medical diagrams that do not behave like literal photographs of reality. The manuscript is unusual, extremely unusual, but unusual is not the same as impossible. So where does this leave the pre-flood science manual theory? It gives that theory a strange kind of opening, but not the opening some people imagine. The book in Yale's library is almost certainly not a physical artifact carried through the world from before the biblical flood. Its vellum points firmly to the early 15th century. Its materials and construction belong to the medieval world, but a 15th century manuscript could in principle preserve older ideas. Medieval scholars copied ancient Greek texts. They translated Arabic scientific works. They inherited fragments of Roman learning, biblical traditions, herbal medicine, astrological systems, and legends of lost civilizations. A medieval writer could claim access to knowledge from Noah, Atlantis, Solomon, Egypt, or some vanished pre-flood world. The physical date does not tell us whether that claim would be true. It only tells us something much more basic and much more solid. Whatever the Voynich Manuscript says, whatever it hides, whatever its author believed, the object itself was made by human hands in the 15th century. Not in a mythical age before history, not in modern times, in a real medieval world of scribes, pigments, parchment, libraries, secrets, and books whose authors hoped somebody someday would understand them. And yet, 600 years later, we are still staring at the same symbols, which brings us to the next problem. What exactly are those symbols? At first, the writing looks almost familiar, not readable, not even close, but familiar in the way a foreign alphabet is familiar. You see lines, you see spaces, you see repeated shapes, you see what appear to be paragraphs, labels, headings, maybe even punctuation. The text moves from left to right across the page in a steady, practiced hand. It fills the margins around plants and diagrams. It curls around naked figures in green pools. It appears beside jars, roots, stars, castles, and circular charts. This writing has a name now, Voices, not because anybody knows what it says. The name is just practical. It means the script of the Voynich Manuscript, a label for the thing we cannot identify. And voya is one of the main reasons this book has resisted explanation for more than a century. The manuscript contains roughly 170,000 to 180,000 individual characters, depending on how you count damaged pages, corrections, and uncertain marks. That is not a few cryptic labels scribbled beside pictures. It is a substantial body of text, a real book's worth of writing, page after page after page, all using the same strange visual system. The characters themselves are distinctive. Many look like loops, hooks, poles, gallows, tiny figures of 8, or combinations of curved strokes. Some are simple and appear constantly. Others are taller and more elaborate, rising above the line like ornate letter forms. There are shapes that resemble a lowercase o, a C, an I, or a Y. But those comparisons can be misleading. They only look familiar because our brains are desperately trying to connect unknown marks to known letters. A symbol that looks like an O may not represent an O sound. It may not be a letter at all. It could represent a syllable, a word, a number, a coded instruction, a shorthand abbreviation, or nothing linguistic whatsoever. That uncertainty infects every attempt to read the manuscript. But the handwriting itself is strikingly fluid. Whoever wrote it was not slowly inventing each symbol one painful stroke at a time. The lines generally have rhythm. They have consistency. They look like the work of someone accustomed to this system, someone who knew where one character ended and the next began. There are places where the pen moves so naturally that the script seems almost cursive, and that matters. A person creating random nonsense could make symbols. Anybody can fill a page with invented marks. But producing more than 200 pages of organized-looking text with repeated forms and stable habits is a different kind of task. It suggests method. It suggests a system, even if we still have no idea what kind of system it is. Researchers had to begin with a simple problem. Before you can analyze a script, how do you even type it? You cannot feed mysterious handwritten symbols into a database unless you first give each one a standardized label. So scholars created transliteration systems. These do not decode voyage. They do not tell us how it sounded. They simply assign Roman letters to recurring shapes so that researchers can compare sequences. The best-known system is called EVA, short for European Voyage Alphabet. Under EVA, a common loop-like character might be represented by one Latin letter, a tall gallows-shaped character by another, and a recurring cluster by a sequence such as cook or chol. Not translations. They are not pronunciations, they are filing labels. Think of it like cataloging unknown animal tracks. You might call one print type A and another type B that lets you compare patterns without pretending you know what creature made them. Using systems like EVA, researchers discovered something immediately fascinating. Voynich is repetitive, very repetitive. Certain words or word-like groups occur again and again. Some clusters appear dozens or hundreds of times. A sequence may show up throughout one section of the manuscript, then become rare in another. Other forms differ by only one small character, as if they might be related words, perhaps singular and plural, noun and adjective, verb and tense, root and suffix, or perhaps they are generated variations in a code. The most famous-looking voices word in transliteration is often written as din. It appears constantly. So do related sequences such as I in Dane and Dane. But that does not mean anyone has found the manuscript's version of the and or God. Frequent words can mean many things. In a natural language, they might be articles, prepositions, endings, or common names. In a cipher, they might be the product of a repeated encryption rule. In a fabricated text, they might simply be the result of an author reusing favorite patterns. Then there is the strange behavior of characters inside lines. Some Voynich signs seem especially likely to occur at the beginning of words. Others appear more often at the end. Certain tall characters show up near the starts of lines or paragraphs with suspicious frequency. There are patterns connected to position on the page, not just position within a word. On some pages, the first word in a line tends to be longer than words that follow. In other places, words near illustrations behave differently from the main running text. That is exactly the kind of detail that makes the manuscript so difficult to dismiss. Random writing should not normally care whether it sits at the start of a line or in the middle, but real writing often does. Medieval scribes used conventions for headings, paragraph openings, abbreviations, labels, and decorative initial letters. Cipher systems can also have position rules. A code may use one symbol at the beginning of a message and another at the end. Shorthand can compress common endings. A deliberately fabricated script can imitate these features too, especially if its creator understood what writing was supposed to look like. The script does not hand us an answer, it hands us more possible answers. And the people behind the writing may not all have been the same person. Careful studies of the handwriting have identified what appear to be multiple scribal hands, usually described as scribe 1, scribe 2, and additional possible contributors. Their letters are not formed in exactly the same way. Their spacing differs, their habits differ. Some appear to dominate certain sections of the book. There may also have been different artists, painters, or later annotators involved in the manuscript's creation. Now, that does not prove Voynich as a real language. Multiple writers could copy a cipher key. They could follow a system of invented symbols. A workshop could collaborate on a hoax just as easily as on a medical encyclopedia. But it does make the manuscript feel less like a single person doodling an undecipherable fantasy in private. Imagine the scale of coordination required. If this is a code, more than one hand may have known the code. If it is a language, several people may have written it. If it is shorthand, they may have belonged to a shared tradition. And if it is fabrication, then somebody went to extraordinary lengths to create the appearance of a living written system, complete with variation, repetition, line habits, and apparent scribal personalities. That is the central trap of Voynich. Everything about it looks organized enough to promise meaning. But organization is not the same thing as meaning. A chessboard is organized, a calendar is organized, a cipher table is organized, a merchant's accounting shorthand is organized. Even a clever fake can be organized. So the next question is more precise and much more dangerous. Does Voynich merely look like language, or does it actually behave like one? That sounds like a question computers should be able to answer in 5 minutes. Take the text, count the words, compare the patterns to English, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, or any of the thousands of languages humans have spoken. If the numbers match, it is language. If they do not, it is not. Except, that is not how language works. Real languages are messy. Writing systems are messy. Medieval manuscripts are especially messy. A 15th century scribe might use abbreviations, omit letters, combine symbols, spell the same word 3 different ways, and follow conventions that make perfect sense only if you were trained in that particular place at that particular time. Then add the possibility of encryption shorthand, or an unknown language written in an unknown alphabet, and the statistics become less like a fingerprint and more like a foggy outline. Still, researchers have tried. One of the first things they looked at was word frequency. In almost every natural language, a small number of words occur constantly in English. The of and to and a appear everywhere in Latin. Words like et meaning and show up again and again. The most common words are usually the grammatical glue. They are short, ordinary, and impossible to avoid. This pattern is often described by Zipf's law, named after linguist George Kingsley Zipf. Put simply, if you rank words by how often they occur, the most common word appears far more than the second most common, the second more than the third, and so on, creating a steep curve. It is not exact. No language follows it perfectly, but the general pattern appears across a remarkable range of human languages, and voices shows something like its most common wordike groups occur very often. Less common forms drop away in a pattern that from a distance resembles the statistical behavior of language. That was exciting. It suggested the manuscript was not just random symbols scattered across parchment. Random text usually does not organize itself into a believable hierarchy of common and rare words. But here is the catch. Zip-like behavior is suggestive, not decisive. Lots of systems can produce it. Computer code can. Lists can. Music can. A carefully designed cipher can. Even processors that are not linguistic at all can generate a handful of common units and a long tail of raw ones. If you repeatedly modify a limited set of patterns, you can create something that looks statistically alive without ever writing a sentence. Think of it like footprints in the snow. A human footprint tells you something passed by, but it does not tell you whether it was a farmer, a soldier, a child, or somebody wearing boots designed to fool you. The pattern gets you closer. It does not solve the case. Then researchers found patterns that are harder to explain. Voynich repeats words in ways natural languages usually do not. Sometimes the same word-like sequence appears twice in a row. Sometimes nearly identical words clustered together. A form appears, then a version with one character changed, then another version with a slightly different ending. It can look less like ordinary prose and more like somebody generating variations from a template. Imagine reading a recipe that said, mix mixer mixed mixing mix over and over again. Not impossible. A technical text can repeat terms. A list can repeat labels. A medicinal manual might use the same plant name, dose, or instruction many times. But the density of near repetition in Voynich is strange enough that linguists keep coming back to it. Some words also seem tied to particular parts of the manuscript. Forms common in the herbal pages may be less common in the astronomical diagrams. Others cluster around labels beside figures and stars. That could be exactly what you would expect from a real book. Different subjects use different vocabulary. A page about plants should not sound exactly like a page about bathing, medicine, or astrology, but a codebook could behave that way too. So could a system where certain symbols identify categories, page types, ingredients, or diagram parts. And then there is entropy. Entropy in this context is a measure of unpredictability. In ordinary language, letters and words are not completely random. After the letter Q in English, you often expect U. After the some words are more likely than others. Language has structure, and structure reduces uncertainty. But language cannot be too predictable either, or every sentence would become a mechanical repetition of the same few forms. Voynich has been tested again and again for this kind of structure. Some studies have found that its character sequences are surprisingly predictable. Given the beginning of a word, the next character can often be guessed more easily than in many natural languages. That has led some researchers to argue that the text is too orderly, too constrained, perhaps generated by a mechanical procedure rather than composed freely in a spoken language. In other words, it may have low entropy. Not enough surprise. But even that conclusion comes with an asterisk. Entropy depends heavily on what you're measuring. Are Voynich's characters letters? Are some of them actually syllables? Are they abbreviations standing for whole chunks of speech? Does one written symbol conceal several sounds? Are spaces truly word boundaries, or do they divide units in some other way? Change those assumptions and the numbers can change dramatically. A language written in syllables would behave differently from one written alphabetically. Medieval abbreviation systems can make words look unnaturally compact and repetitive. A technical shorthand might recycle the same symbols constantly while encoding far more information than is visible on the page. And if Voynich represents a language with an unusual grammatical structure, comparing it too closely with English or Latin could send researchers in exactly the wrong direction. There are real languages where words carry long chains of grammatical information. There are languages where a single written form can represent what English needs an entire phrase to express. There are writing systems where vowels are omitted, where symbols represent consonant groups, where context does most of the work. A manuscript built around such a system could look bizarre to us without being meaningless. So where does that leave us? Voynich's behaves enough like language to keep the language hypothesis alive. Its word frequencies, section-specific vocabulary, repeated structures, and positional habits do not look like pure chaos. But it also behaves oddly enough to resist easy classification. Its repetitions are excessive. Its words are built from a limited set of recurring pieces. Its statistical regularity may be a clue to grammar, shorthand, or syllabic writing. Or it may be a clue to concealment, because the most important possibility is still sitting in the middle of the room. What if Voynich is not a language at all? What if it is language transformed by a cipher, a code, or a writing system designed specifically to keep outsiders from reading it? That question sounds simple, but the words matter. Cipher, code, concealed writing, shorthand. People use them interchangeably. Cryptographers do not. A substitution cipher is the classic secret alphabet. You take ordinary text and replace each letter with another symbol. Maybe A becomes a strange loop, B becomes a gallows-shaped character, C becomes a tiny circle. Write plant medicine using the replacements, and anyone without the alphabet sees nonsense. But underneath the structure of the original language is still there. The most common plain text letter stays the most common cipher symbol. Short words remain short. Repeated words remain repeated. That is why substitution ciphers can often be cracked with frequency analysis. In English, E is common. In Latin, certain endings appear constantly. If one strange symbol shows up everywhere, especially in positions where a vowel might belong, it becomes a suspect. Then you test possibilities. You look for patterns. A 3-character word with the same first and last symbol could be I, did, non, or one of countless other options. Slowly, if you have enough text, the hidden language starts pushing through. Voynich has been attacked this way for more than a century. Researchers have assumed that each Voynich character stands for a letter of Latin, Italian, German, Hebrew, or some other language. They have counted frequencies, tested likely words, searched for common medieval endings, and tried to force the strange script into recognizable grammatical patterns. Again and again, the attempts collapse. Not because simple substitution is impossible. It is possible. But because the manuscript does not yield cleanly, a proposed coding may produce one promising word, then 10 pages of gibberish. It may identify what looks like a plant name in the herbal section, but fail completely in the astronomical diagrams. It may generate fragments that resemble Latin only because Latin has so many short, flexible words that chance can create convincing illusions. And there is a deeper problem. Under a simple substitution system, repeated Voynich words should usually represent repeated, plain text words. If a particular sequence appears dozens of times, it ought to decode as something common and the of perhaps a frequent technical term. But no proposed solution has consistently turned those repetitions into readable language across the manuscript. Then there are codes. A code does not necessarily replace letters. It replaces whole words, concepts, names, or instructions. A symbol might mean water. Another might mean boil. A particular word like group might stand for a specific herb, a measurement, a person, or an astrological condition. In a modern code book, 40,872 might mean send reinforcements. No one could crack that by asking what English letter 4 represents, because 4 does not represent a letter. It represents part of a stored instruction. This matters because the Voinich Manuscript looks at least in places like a specialized book. Plants, stars, bodies, jars, roots, recipes. If its author wanted to protect medical, alchemical, or astrological knowledge, a codebook system would make sense. The text might not be hiding everyday conversation. It might be hiding procedures, ingredients, doses, correspondences, and names that were valuable, restricted, or potentially dangerous in the wrong hands. Medieval Europe was full of reasons to conceal knowledge. Physicians guarded remedies. Alchemists wrapped experiments in obscure language. Astrologers, magicians, and religious dissident all had reasons to make their writings difficult for outsiders. Sometimes secrecy was practical. Sometimes it was professional. Sometimes obscurity itself created authority. If only the initiated could understand your book, you looked like you possessed something rare. But a codebook has a weakness. It requires a codebook. Without the list that says this symbol means mercury, this word means wormwood, and this repeated phrase means heat gently for 3 days. An outsider is almost blind. Frequency analysis may still reveal patterns, but it cannot magically tell you what the units refer to. The most common term could mean and/or water, or take, or 1 ounce, or the name of the most frequently used plant in the entire manual. Then there is steganography, that is not encryption in the usual sense. It is the art of hiding a message inside something that looks harmless. The secret is not merely unreadable. Ideally, nobody even realizes it exists. A steganographic manuscript might conceal information in the first letters of lines, the number of words per paragraph, unusual letter shapes, colored marks, illustrations, or carefully chosen positions on a page. The visible Voynich text could be a cover, while the real message lies somewhere else. That idea is fascinating because the manuscript is packed with diagrams, labels, stars, plants, and strange human figures. Maybe the writing is not the whole system, maybe it is camouflage. But here the evidence becomes thin. There are many possible hidden patterns in any complicated object, especially one with hundreds of pages. If you search long enough, you can find numbers, alignments, acrostics, and coincidences almost anywhere. A real steganographic solution would need more than an intriguing pattern. It would need a repeatable method that extracts coherent information from page after page without arbitrary exceptions. And then there is shorthand. Shorthand is not necessarily secret at all. It is writing designed for speed or compression. Medieval scribes used abbreviations constantly. A single mark could stand for an entire common ending. A symbol might represent conra, tuan, or a whole frequently repeated word. Medical and legal writers developed dense professional conventions that could look like coded language to anyone outside the trade. Suppose voyachizasi is an extreme shorthand. One character might not represent one letter. It might represent a syllable, a sound, a common prefix, or an entire grammatical ending. That would help explain why its words seem built from recurring chunks. It could also explain why the text appears unusually predictable. If scribes repeatedly use a limited inventory of compressed forms, the writing will look more regular than ordinary prose. But shorthand should still connect to a language somehow. It should preserve enough structure that, given a large manuscript, researchers can begin identifying recurring grammatical behavior. So far, that connection remains elusive. The more complicated cipher proposals go even further. Maybe the manuscript uses multiple secret alphabets instead of one. In a polyalphabetic cipher, the same plain text letter can be written differently depending on its position, a keyword, or a changing sequence. An E might become one symbol in one word, another symbol in the next, and something entirely different later on. That destroys the simple frequency patterns that make substitution ciphers vulnerable. This is a powerful idea. It could explain why Voynich resists ordinary letter-for-letter decoding, but it comes with historical complications. The manuscript's parchment was produced in the early 15th century. Sophisticated polyalphabetic systems were beginning to appear in Europe around that period, but they were not the everyday tools of ordinary scribes. Leon Battista Alberti described an important polyalphabetic method in the 1460s after the parchment's estimated date range, though dating parchment does not prove exactly when the text was written. Later systems, often loosely called Voynich ciphers, belong to an even later cryptographic tradition. So could a 15th century author have used a complex changing cipher? Possibly. Human ingenuity does not wait politely for textbook dates, but the more elaborate the proposed system becomes, the more evidence we should demand. A theory cannot just say maybe the author used an unknown cipher with unknown rules. That explains everything, and therefore explains nothing. A good cipher hypothesis should fit the manuscript's actual behavior. It should explain why certain characters appear mostly at the beginnings or ends of words, why similar words cluster together, why different sections seem to use different vocabularies, why some labels are short, while the running text is long, why the script was written with such apparent fluency without visible corrections or hesitation. And most importantly, it should turn the text into something readable, consistent, and historically plausible. That final requirement is the wall every proposed solution eventually hits. Cryptanalysts normally want a key, a known phrase, a bilingual reference, or at least an external clue. The Rosetta Stone worked because the same decree appeared in multiple scripts, including Greek, which scholars could already read. A wartime code can be broken if you know a message probably begins with weather report, or if you capture the enemy's code book. The Voynich Manuscript gives us none of that. No key, no translation, no author's note, no confirmed language, no sentence we can independently identify. We have a locked door, but no keyhole we recognize. And that means every possible method remains on the table. Simple cipher, code book, shorthand, steganography, some hybrid system combining all of them. A writing method built to conceal specialized knowledge from anyone who had not been taught how to read it. But if that is what the Voynich Manuscript is, then its author did an extraordinary job. 600 years later, we are still standing outside. And nowhere does that locked door feel more frustrating than in the manuscript's largest and most immediately recognizable section, the herbal pages. For much of the book, the format looks almost familiar. One page, one plant. A large drawing rises from the bottom or fills the center. Roots spread into the parchment. A stem climbs upward. Leaves branch off to the sides. At the top, a flower, seed pod, or cluster of strange structures opens like a clue we almost understand. Beside the image sits a block of Voynich text, as if the author is telling us exactly what this plant is, where it grows, what part to harvest, and what it can cure. This was a standard medieval way to organize medical knowledge. Herbals were among the most practical books of the Middle Ages. A herbal was essentially a guide to plants and their uses, which leaf stopped bleeding, which root eased pain, which flower could be steeped into a tea, which plant was useful for digestion, fever, wounds, childbirth, insomnia, or, depending on the writer, matters more magical than medical. In a world before laboratories and chemical drug names, plants mattered enormously. They were medicine, food, dye, perfume, poison, ritual material, and raw ingredients for everything from ink to incense. Knowing a plant could mean knowing how to survive. But there was a problem. Plant names changed from region to region. One herb could have 5 local names. The same name could refer to completely different plants in different places. And texts were copied by hand, often across centuries and languages. So, illustrations became essential. A reader might not know what a word meant, but they could look at the shape of a leaf, the color of a flower, the form of a root, and hopefully avoid brewing a deadly poison instead of a cure. That is why the Voynich botanical section feels so tantalizing. It appears to be speaking a visual language we should recognize, except the plants do not behave. At first glance, some look almost identifiable. Researchers have proposed dozens of candidates over the years. A page may seem to show a sunflower-like bloom, a violet, a water lily, a thistle, a fern, a mandray, a lily, some kind of wild ginger. Certain roots look familiar. Some leaves resemble known medicinal herbs. A few flowers appear to belong, at least vaguely, to recognizable botanical families. Then you look closer. A plant may have leaves shaped like one species, flowers belonging to another, and a root system that seems borrowed from something else entirely. It may have stems that branch in impossible ways. Flowers may grow where seed heads should be. Leaves may emerge in patterns that no real plant uses. Colors are often unhelpful, not only because pigments fade, but because medieval artists did not always paint for strict botanical accuracy. A blue leaf might be decorative. A red root might signal heat, blood, danger, or medicinal importance, rather than literal color. Some Voynich plants look less like individual species than botanical dreams. Familiar pieces assembled into unfamiliar wholes. Imagine trying to identify an animal drawn with the neck of a swan, the paws of a fox, the feathers of an eagle, and the tail of a fish. You could spend years asking whether it is a swan, fox, eagle, or fish, but maybe the answer is none of them. Maybe it is a composite creature designed to represent an idea rather than an organism. The same possibility hangs over the herbal pages. Perhaps each illustration is a real plant rendered badly. That is not as absurd as it sounds. Medieval copying could be a brutal process for images. A scribe copies a herbal from an older manuscript. He has never seen the plant. He reproduces the drawing as best he can. The next corpus works from his version, not from nature. After several generations, a recognizably shaped leaf becomes a decorative curl. A flower turns into a geometric ornament. Roots become a tangled mass, because the artist knows roots should look complicated, even if he has no idea how this particular plant grows. It is like making a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, except every copy is redrawn by hand, by someone who may not understand the subject. This could explain some of the manuscript's strangest features. The author or artist may have been preserving images from a much older source. A Greek herbal translated into Arabic, copied into Latin, altered in another language, then finally written into Voye. Each stage could introduce distortions. What survives would not be a field guide drawn from life. It would be the fossil of a field guide. And there is evidence that medieval herbals could become wildly stylized. Many surviving manuscripts show plants that are flattened, exaggerated, simplified, or arranged in ways no botanist would accept today. The purpose was not always scientific precision. Sometimes the image acted as a mnemonic, a visual reminder for someone who already knew the tradition. If you had learned from a teacher that this odd, red-rooted drawing meant a certain remedy, accuracy did not matter nearly as much as recognition. But the Voynich plants are strange even by medieval standards. The manuscript's botanical illustrations seem to mix careful observation with apparent invention. Some leaves show fine veins. Some roots are rendered with obsessive attention. Certain flowers have delicate internal structures. That suggests an artist who could look closely at nature when they wanted to. Yet other details seem impossible, not merely stylized. Impossible. So maybe the drawings are not meant to identify plants literally at all. A plant could stand for an ingredient category. A bitter herb, a warming root, a cooling flower, a plant associated with the liver, the womb, the skin, or the planets. Medieval medicine was built on correspondences, hot and cold, wet and dry, zodiac signs and body parts, colors and humors. In that world, a plant did not just have a species name, it had a place in a cosmic system. A strange plant with red roots and blue leaves might be a visual formula. Heat below, coolness above, earth joined to water, blood balanced by some imagined celestial influence. The illustration might encode how the ingredient should be prepared, what season it should be harvested, or which part of the body it was believed to affect. Or the plants could represent places. Different regions produce different drugs, spices, resins, and medicinal herbs. A manuscript intended for traders, physicians, or initiates might use botanical images as symbols for distant lands. This plant means the eastern mountains. That flower means an island source. Those strange roots mean a material imported through a particular port. If so, researchers looking for exact species may be asking the wrong question. And there is an even stranger possibility. The images might encode words. If the text is a codebook, perhaps each plant is not the subject of the paragraph beside it. Perhaps it is the key. A distinctive root shape, leaf count, flower color, or arrangement of parts could identify a coded ingredient or concept. Created images that were deliberately memorable precisely because they were not natural. A real plant can be confused with another real plant. An impossible plant once learned is unmistakable. Think about that. The bizarre features may not be mistakes. They may be labels. This would help explain why attempts at plant identification have produced so many confident but contradictory answers. One researcher sees a familiar herb in a leaf. Another sees a different herb in the flower. A third points out that the roots fit neither. They may all be partially right because the image may contain fragments of several traditions, or because it was never intended to represent a single living species in the first place. The herbal pages promise the easiest breakthrough in the entire manuscript. Surely we tell ourselves, identify the plant and the text beside it will follow. But 600 years later, the plants remain as unreadable as the words. And once we move beyond roots, leaves, and flowers, the manuscript becomes stranger still, because the next pages lift their eyes from the earth to the sky. Circles, stars, zodiac figures, and diagrams that may be tracking the heavens, the human body or something no one has yet recognized. And the next pages lift their eyes from the earth to the sky. Or at least they seem to. The Voynich Manuscript contains a sequence of circular diagrams filled with stars, rays, rings, little labels, and images that look unmistakably zodiacal. There are suns or sun-like forms, there are moon-like faces, there are rosettes and spinning wheels, and there are the familiar signs of the zodiac: ram, bull, twins, crab, lion, maiden, scale, scorpion, archer, goat, water-bearer, fish. For one brief moment, it feels like the manuscript is finally giving us something solid. We know those symbols. Medieval readers knew them too. The zodiac was everywhere in Europe. It appeared in church sculptures, calendars, medical books, almanacs, cathedral windows, and the margins of handwritten manuscripts. You did not have to be a professional astronomer to recognize Aries or Scorpio. The signs organized the year. They marked the movement of the sun through the seasons, and according to the medical beliefs of the time, they helped explain what was happening inside the human body. But then, of course, the Voynich Manuscript refuses to be simple. The zodiac figures appear inside circular bands, surrounded by dozens of small female figures. Most are nude. Many stand inside little compartments or tubs. Each holds a star, sometimes connected to a short line of voices text. The result looks less like a normal calendar and more like a cosmic machine populated by tiny identical attendants. What are they doing? One possibility is that these women represent days. Medieval calendars divided the year into months, weeks, feast days, lunar phases, and astrological intervals. A ring of figures around a zodiac sign may be a way of counting time. Each woman, each star, each tiny label could represent a date or a particular division of a month. That idea becomes especially tempting because many of the diagrams seem to involve numbers close to 30. 30 days in a month, roughly 30 degrees in each zodiac sign, about 29.5 days in a lunar cycle. Medieval calendar makers were obsessed with this kind of counting because getting the timing right mattered. Plant at the wrong time, bleed a patient at the wrong time, begin a treatment under the wrong sign, and you might believe you had disrupted the balance of the body itself. This was not fringe belief in the 15th century. Astrology and medicine were deeply connected. Physicians often believed the heavens influenced health. The moon was thought to affect bodily fluids. The zodiac signs were linked to particular parts of the body. Aries governed the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms and shoulders, Cancer the chest, Leo the heart, Virgo the abdomen, Libra the lower back, Scorpio the reproductive organs, Sagittarius the thighs, Capricorn the knees, Aquarius the legs, Pisces the feet. This was the logic behind the famous zodiac man, an image found in many medieval medical books. A human body stands in the center surrounded by signs of the zodiac, each one assigned to a body part. A doctor consulting such a chart might decide when it was safe to perform bloodletting, when to administer a remedy, or when to avoid treating a particular organ entirely. So when the Voinich Manuscript combined zodiac signs, female bodies, water, stars, and short labels, it is not unreasonable to suspect a medical calendar. Maybe these are not just women in tubs, maybe they represent the body moving through celestial time. Fertility, menstruation, pregnancy, bathing, herbal treatment, and lunar cycles were all subjects medieval medicine tried to place inside a larger cosmic order. But there are problems. The Voynich zodiac pages do not follow a fully recognizable system. Some signs look conventional enough. The ram looks like a ram. The bull looks like a bull. The lion is a lion. But the layout is strange. Aries and Taurus each seem to receive more than one diagram, as if the manuscript is dividing their periods into separate sections. The women surrounding the signs are not arranged in a way that clearly matches a standard European calendar. And the star counts do not settle neatly into one obvious astronomical pattern. Some diagrams contain stars in numbers that suggest chondrical divisions. Others appear to have too many, too few, or simply the wrong arrangement for an ordinary star chart. The stars themselves are stylized, often with 8 points, and many are connected to labels written in Voyniches. If those labels were names, perhaps they could identify days, constellations, lunar stations, or medical instructions. But we cannot read them, and without the text, the diagrams become a kind of celestial Rorschach test. One researcher sees an astronomical chart, another sees an astrological calendar, another sees a ritual diagram, another C-coded system built around reproduction, bathing, and medicine. All can point to real medieval traditions. None can make the whole section click into place. It may be that the manuscript is using familiar zodiac imagery as a doorway into something more specialized. A reader sees Pisces and immediately knows the season. They see the ring of women and understand a sequence of days, treatments, or lunar phases. The image does not need to explain itself because it belongs to a tradition already known to the intended audience, or it may be blending traditions that normally stayed separate. Astronomy, astrology, medicine, religious symbolism, and private ritual could all be packed into the same wheel. That is what makes these pages so unsettling. The zodiac is supposed to be our anchor. It is one of the few things in the book we can recognize with confidence. But recognition is not understanding. We can name the ram, we can name the bull, we can point to the fish and say, yes, that is Pisces. What we cannot say is why they are surrounded by these women. Why the stars are counted this way, why the diagrams are built in these strange layers, or what the unreadable words are telling us to do when the heavens reach a particular point in their endless cycle, and then the manuscript turns from the sky back toward the body. Because the women around the zodiac wheels are only the beginning. On the pages that follow, they multiply, descend into green liquid flow through elaborate pipes and chambers, and enter the manuscript's most bizarre and controversial world. This is the section scholars often call the biological pages, or the ballological section. Ballological comes from the study of baths and therapeutic waters, and that name makes sense at first glance because the pages are full of water. Green water, specifically pools of it, tubes full of it, little channels carrying it from one strange structure to another. But calling these pages the bathing section is a bit like calling a cathedral a building with chairs. Technically true, completely inadequate. The images show dozens of nude female figures, usually pale, round-faced, and almost interchangeable. Some stand waist-deep in green pools. Some emerge from vessel-like containers. Some hold little objects that could be flowers, spindles, or symbols. Others climb through what look like pipes, ducts, funnels, and branching channels. The boundaries between bodies, containers, and plumbing are strangely unclear. Are these women bathing? Are they moving through an imagined body? Are the pipes natural springs, blood vessels, reproductive organs, distillation equipment, or something else entirely? The manuscript does not tell us, at least not in any language we can read. The green liquid is one of the first things everyone notices. It fills tubs shaped like castles, barrels, basins, and organic chambers. It flows through blue and green tubes, sometimes connecting one woman to another. Medical textbook. Diagrams of tubes and fluids immediately make us think of anatomy. Arteries, veins, lymphatic vessels, fallopian tubes, the digestive system, the reproductive system. And that is exactly why these images have inspired so much speculation. Some researchers have proposed that the biological section is an encoded picture of female anatomy and reproduction. The nude figures could represent stages of conception, pregnancy, childbirth, menstruation, or the movement of bodily fluids. The vessels could be wombs, the channels could be tubes within the body. Certain large structures have been compared to ovaries, uteruses, or even microscopic cells, though those comparisons can become very loose very quickly. There is a genuine reason fertility comes up so often. Medieval medicine devoted enormous attention to reproduction. Not always accurate attention, obviously, but intense attention. Physicians, midwives, herbalists, and learned writers discussed conception, miscarriage, infertility, menstruation, lactation, sexual health, and childbirth. They argued over which herbs warmed the womb, which foods strengthened semen, which baths encouraged conception, and which celestial conditions might influence pregnancy. The female body was seen not as a mystery outside medicine, but as a central medical problem to be interpreted, managed, and very often controlled. And water mattered. Across medieval Europe, bathing was associated with health, recovery, cleanliness, fertility, and pleasure. Natural hot springs attracted visitors looking for relief from pain, skin conditions, digestive troubles, and reproductive problems. Baths existed in cities. Medical writers recommended bathing under particular conditions. Mineral waters were believed to possess specific properties. One spring might be warming, another drying, another cleansing, another good for the joints, the stomach, or the womb. This was all tied to humoral medicine, the dominant medical framework inherited from Greek and Roman authorities. The body was thought to contain 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on balance. Too much heat, cold, dryness, or moisture could produce illness. A treatment was supposed to restore equilibrium. Food, herbs, purging, bloodletting, exercise, sleep, sex, and bathing could all be part of that effort. So, a manuscript showing women immersed in colored liquid, surrounded by plants, stars, containers, and unexplained text, does not need to be a secret modern anatomy manual to belong in a 15th century medical world. It could be working with concepts its original readers already knew. The body is a system of flows, health as balance, fertility as a condition influenced by heat, moisture, seasons, and the heavens. If you like mysteries where the evidence is real, but the answers stay just out of reach, the channel's book about 12 unexplained mysteries goes deeper into cases like this. You can find it through the website link in the description. But here is where we need to be careful. The Voynich biological pages are weird, no question. Yet weirdness is not proof of advanced science. Medieval art was highly symbolic. A drawing of a body did not have to look anatomically realistic to be medically meaningful. Rivers could stand for fluids. Gardens could stand for fertility. Castles could stand for organs, cities, family lines, or abstract spaces. Nude figures could represent souls, bodies, virtues, diseases, astrological forces, stages of life, or simply be-thers. A pipe-like form may look biological to us because we are trained by diagrams, microscopes, and hospital charts. But the manuscript artist was not drawing for modern readers. In fact, some details point strongly toward a medieval visual language. The women wear little crowns in some places. The containers resemble the architectural forms found in contemporary manuscripts. The green pools may evoke herbal or mineral baths rather than some hidden chemical medium. And the figures are not drawn with the precision we would expect if the goal were to teach anatomy in the modern sense. Still, something deliberate is happening. The pages are too densely organized to be random decoration. Women appear again and again. Fluids move through repeated structures. Text blocks sit beside the images as if explaining procedures, ingredients, names, or instructions. The section seems to be about bodies in motion, bodies in water, bodies connected to systems larger than themselves. And that is why it sits at the center of claims about hidden knowledge. For believers in the pre-flood science theory, these are not bath scenes at all. They are diagrams preserving ancient biological knowledge in symbolic form. They see reproductive science, fluid circulation, even hints of microscopic life concealed behind medieval-looking artwork. The women are not people, they argue. They are cells, organs, or stages in an unknown process. It is a fascinating idea, but fascination is not evidence. The honest answer is more unsettling. We can recognize the themes: water, women, health, fertility, medicine, possibly anatomy. We can place them within traditions that existed in the medieval world. But we cannot yet explain why this particular manuscript arranged them in this particular impossible-looking system. And once you have followed the green water through its pipes and chambers, the book offers another clue. Not a readable one, not a clear one, but a clue in the form of roots, leaves, jars, and what may be its closest thing to actual recipes. Turn the page, and the women and green channels give way to something that looks almost familiar. Almost. This part of the Voynich manuscript is usually called the pharmaceutical section. The name comes from its repeated images of jars, containers, roots, leaves, and small pieces of plants. Not whole plants standing proudly on a page like the strange specimens in the herbal section. Here the plants seem to have been broken apart. A leaf on one page, a root on another, a cluster of flowers, a seed head, a bulb fragments arranged around squat vessels painted in blue, green, red, yellow, and brown. It looks less like a garden and more like a medicine cabinet. And that matters because medieval medicine was intensely practical. A physician or herbalist did not just want to know what a plant looked like. They wanted to know which part to use: the root, the leaf, the bark, the flower, the sap. They wanted to know when to gather it, how to dry it, whether to grind it into powder, steep it in wine, boil it in water, mix it with honey, fat, vinegar, or another herb, and crucially, what kind of body it was supposed to treat. A root could be warming, a leaf could be drying, a seed could purge the body. A syrup could calm a cough, an ointment could draw out infection. At least that was the logic of the medical world the manuscript seems to inhabit. Remember humoral medicine. Everything had qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry. A disease was not just a disease, it was an imbalance. Too much heat, too much moisture, a blockage, a corruption, a weakness in some part of the body. Treatment meant pushing the body back toward balance, using substances believed to have opposing properties. So when we see jars beside plant parts, the basic idea is not mysterious at all. Jars are where ingredients go, where powders, oils, syrups, pastes, and preserved herbs go. Roots are what you gather before you turn them into something useful. Medieval pharmaceutical books often organized knowledge in exactly this way. Some were herbals identifying plants and listing their virtues. Some were recipe collections, sometimes called antidotatories, describing compound medicines made from multiple ingredients. Others focused on simples, individual substances used on their own. Those substances did not come only from plants. They could include minerals, animal products, resins, spices imported from distant places, even substances that would make a modern pharmacist WSE. The Voynich pages seem to be hovering somewhere in that world. Each illustration is often paired with a short block of voices text. Sometimes there are little labels tucked near a root or leaf. Sometimes the writing is arranged in compact paragraphs, as if the illustrator expected the reader to look at the ingredient, then read an entry explaining it. That structure has encouraged a very reasonable possibility. Perhaps these are names of ingredients, short medicinal notes or instructions for preparation. Maybe this root was to be crushed. Maybe that leaf was to be boiled. Maybe a jar contained a finished compound, a medicine made from several substances. But that word maybe is doing a lot of work because we cannot read the labels. And without reading them, we cannot tell whether a little word identifies a plant, names a disease, gives a dosage, marks an astrological condition, or says something completely unrelated. The layout resembles a pharmaceutical handbook. The pictures resemble ingredients and vessels, but resemblance is not translation. Still, there are intriguing comparisons. The jars themselves have parallels in European medieval manuscripts, especially medical and alchemical works, where containers were drawn to represent stored preparations, distilled liquids, or apothecary substances. Their shapes are often decorative rather than technically precise. Some have elaborate lids, some look almost architectural. They are not the clean glass bottles of a modern laboratory. They belong to a world where medicine, cooking, perfume making, dyeing, brewing, and alchemy could overlap in the same workshop. And the plant fragments have parallels too. European herbals sometimes isolated useful parts of a plant rather than showing the whole living specimen. Near Eastern and Islamic medical traditions, which preserved and expanded Greek medical learning, also produced richly illustrated texts about drugs, herbs, and compound remedies. Medical knowledge moved across languages and borders. Greek Snort's works were translated into Arabic. Arabic medical texts were translated into Latin. Trade routes carried pepper, ginger, cinnamon, aloe, resins, and other prize materials into Europeanese. The Voynich Manuscript could reflect that wider world, not necessarily as a direct copy of one known source, but as a book made within a medical culture that borrowed constantly, translated constantly, and mixed local practice with inherited authority. That would make it, in one sense, less alien, but it also makes the mystery sharper. If this was an herbal compendium for practical use, why are so many plants so difficult to identify? Why do the jars have no readable labels? Why does the script refuse every serious attempt at translation? And why has no proposed system of medicine unlocked the text? Researchers have tried. Some have looked for Latin herbal names. Others have searched for Romance languages, Germanic languages, Hebrew, Arabic, Turkish, Nahuatl, and invented ciphers. People have matched individual drawings to real plants and built entire theories around the match. But the problem is that medieval plant art can be stylized, inaccurate, copied from copies, or altered to fit the page. If you want a drawing to be a sunflower, a mandre, a lily, or a ginseng root badly enough, you can often find a way to see it. That is not how a solution works. A real breakthrough would need to explain the writing across the manuscript, not just one appealing plant. It would need to produce readings that are consistent, testable, and meaningful on page after page. So far, no medicinal interpretation has met that standard well enough to convince the broader scholarly community, which leaves us with a strange possibility. The pharmaceutical pages may be the manuscript's most practical-looking section, a working guide to substances, preparations, and cures. Yet, they are also among the clearest reminders that looking practical is not the same as being understood. The book seems to offer us jars, roots, ingredients, recipes, and then it seals every one of them behind an unreadable word. And then, near the end of the manuscript, the book unfolds, literally. Hidden among the ordinary-look leaves is a large fold-out page, usually called the rosettes page. It opens across multiple panels, creating the biggest and most ambitious image in the entire Voinich manuscript. Instead of one plant, one group of bathing women, or one circular astronomical diagram, you get a whole connected world, or at least something that looks like one. The page is organized around 9 large circular forms, usually called rosettes, because their outer edges resemble flowers, wheels, or decorative seals. They are arranged in a grid, 3 across and 3 down. But these circles do not sit alone. Lines, tubes, paths, and bands of color appear to connect them. Around and between them are walls, towers, stars, little structures, blue winding forms that may represent water, and strange shapes that look almost mechanical. It is the Voinich manuscript at its most map-like, and that single word has launched an enormous number of theories. At first glance, some of the circles look like enclosed cities. They have crenellated walls like medieval castles. Some have towers. One enclosure seems to have gates or openings. Another has what looks like a ring of buildings around its edge. The details are small, stylized, and difficult to interpret, but the architectural feeling is hard to ignore. You look at those battlements and think settlement. You look at the pathways between the circles and think roads. You look at the blue channels and think rivers, canals, or some kind of water system. And then the whole thing starts to feel less like an abstract diagram and more like a plan of a place. But what place? One possibility is that it is cosmological. Medieval manuscripts were full of diagrams that mapped the structure of creation, the earth at the center, the heavenly spheres surrounding it, winds, stars, planets, elements, directions, seasons, and spiritual realms arranged in circles. A circle did not have to mean a physical city. It could mean a celestial sphere, a region of the universe, a stage in the movement of the soul, or an abstract category in a system of knowledge. The Voinich manuscript has already shown us that it likes circles. The astronomical and astrological pages are built from them. Zodiac figures sit inside them. Stars spill around them. Wheels within wheels suggest motion, cycles, and correspondence. So, the rosettes page could be the grand version of that same idea. Not a map of land, but a map of the cosmos. Maybe each rosette represents a different realm. Maybe the connecting bands show how forces, fluids, or influences move between them. Maybe the castles are not castles at all, but symbolic boundaries. The blue shapes may not be rivers. They could be heavenly waters, the classical elements or channels in some medical theory of the body and the universe. That may sound like a stretch, but so does calling it a city map, because a real map normally gives us anchors, names, coastlines, rivers with recognizable routes, a scale, a geographic pattern that can be matched to an actual region. The rosettes fold-out gives us none of those things. It gives us visual suggestions, not a readable key. And that is where the mystery gets dangerous. The fold-out contains motifs that feel uncannily familiar. Towers, walls, waterways, branching routes, enclosures connected to enclosures. In a modern mind, it can resemble infrastructure, a network, an engineered landscape, maybe a hydraulic system with water flowing from one circular zone to another, maybe a city plan, maybe several cities joined by roads, tunnels, or canals. Some researchers and enthusiasts have suggested it could depict an allegorical landscape, not a literal place, but a journey through an imagined world. A sacred geography, a diagram of pilgrimage, a representation of paradise, the earthly garden, or a spiritual universe divided into regions. Others see a medical diagram expanded to impossible scale. The circles could be organs, bodily systems, or zones of influence. The connecting channels could be veins, ducts, or flows of humors. That interpretation gains some support from the manuscript's earlier bathing scenes, where women appear in tubes and pools of colored liquid. Maybe the same visual vocabulary is being used here, only on a larger and more abstract level. Then there are the stars. Star-like symbols appear across the fold-out, just as they appear elsewhere in the manuscript. Some sit inside the rosettes, others seem to mark boundaries or spaces between them. If this is a geographic map, are they locations? If it is a cosmological diagram, are they actual stars? If it is an allegory, Are they spiritual markers, astrological forces, or simply decoration? We do not know.
And that uncertainty is exactly why the page attracts lost civilization theories.
To someone searching for evidence of forgotten high technology, the fold-out can look like a schematic. Its channels become pipelines, its towers become engineered installations, its circular enclosures become power stations, ancient cities or nodes in a vanished global network. To someone looking for Atlantis, a pre-flood world, or inherited knowledge from a civilization older than recorded history, this page seems almost designed to provoke the imagination. It is large, it is complex. It seems to show systems connected across space, and unlike a normal medieval map, it refuses to tell us where we are. But visual resemblance is not identification. A blue line can resemble a canal without being a canal. Crenellations can resemble fortifications without depicting a real fortress. A circle linked to another circle can look like engineering because humans use networks everywhere in maps, anatomy, theology, astronomy, alchemy, and even decorative art. The Rosette's page may preserve a real place. It may be a symbolic universe. It may combine geography, astrology, medicine, and religious imagery in a way no surviving book quite matches. Or it may be something more ordinary, a medieval diagram whose meaning would have been obvious to its intended reader, but has become opaque because the language around it is locked away. Still, when the fold-out opens, it feels like the manuscript is making its boldest claim. Not just here are plants, not just here are remedies, but here is the structure of reality. The question is whether that reality belonged to 15th century Europe, to an older tradition copied and transformed over centuries, or only to the mind of the person who made the most unreadable book in history. And that possibility leads to one of the boldest theories ever attached to the Voynich Manuscript. What if it is not simply a strange book from 15th century Europe? What if it is a copy of something much older, not just ancient in the ordinary sense, not Greek, Roman, Egyptian, or Babylonian, older than recorded history, older, according to the theory, than the flood? When people call the Voynich Manuscript a pre-flood science manual, they usually do not mean that the physical book survived a worldwide catastrophe in a waterproof box for thousands of years. The parchment has been carbon dated to the early 15th century. The pigments, ink, binding history, and artistic style all place the object we have in the late medieval world. That part is not really in dispute. The claim is more complicated. Proponents suggest that the 15th century manuscript could be a copy translation or encoded survival of knowledge inherited from an antediluvian civilization. A civilization that existed before a great flood destroyed the old world. A civilization whose science, medicine, astronomy, botany, and engineering survived only in fragments, carried forward by a few survivors, and transformed into legend. It sounds extreme, but it draws on a very old human idea. Flood stories appear in cultures across the world. The most famous is Noah's flood in the Book of Genesis. But there is also the flood of Utnapishtim in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, written down thousands of years before the biblical text reached its final form. Greek traditions told of Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving a catastrophic flood. Hindu traditions describe Manu warned by a fish that a deluge is coming. Different stories, different gods, different landscapes, but a similar pattern. An old world ends in water. A small number survive and knowledge must be carried into the new one. For medieval readers, this was not mythology in the modern sense. Many believed history reached back to Adam, Noah, Babel, and the first patriarchs. They believed ancient people may have possessed knowledge later generations had lost. Astronomy, medicine, the secrets of plants, the movements of the heavens, the hidden properties of stones, metals, and waters. Some traditions claimed that Adam himself had been given vast wisdom. Others credited Noah, Solomon, Hermes, Trismegistus, or mysterious sages from Egypt and Babylon. Medieval scholars did not always imagine history as a steady climb upward. Sometimes they imagined the opposite, The past had been closer to creation. Therefore, the past might have known things the present had forgotten. And if you already believe lost knowledge can pass through the centuries in damaged, coded, or misunderstood form, then the Voynich Manuscript becomes almost irresistible. Look at the plants. Many of them resemble recognizable medieval herbs, only in the loosest possible way. A leaf looks familiar, but the root is wrong. A flower resembles one species, while the stem resembles another. Some plants appear to be composites, as if the illustrator had combined several real specimens into one impossible organism. To a conventional historian, that may suggest stylization, copying errors, fantasy, or a medical tradition we do not yet understand. To a believer in antediluvian science, those plants might be extinct, or they might be medicinal species from a vanished landscape, remembered imperfectly by later copyists. Then there are the diagrams, circular wheels, stars, zodiac figures, pipes, channels, and linked enclosures. The rosette's fold-out especially invites this kind of reading. Its blue waterways can look like a hydraulic network. Its connected circles can look like settlements, facilities, or nodes in a larger system. Its towers and walls can become the remains of a forgotten civilization mapped in symbolic form. And the biological pages push the theory even further. Women standing in green liquid, women emerging from tubes, networks of vessels connecting pools, containers, and bodies. Some viewers see medieval medicine. Others see anatomy, reproduction, circulation, or an attempt to diagram biological processes centuries before modern anatomy had the language to describe them. If the text cannot be read, the images become a blank screen for speculation. Maybe the book encodes advanced botanical knowledge. Maybe it preserves astronomical observations from before known civilizations. Maybe the strange channels show irrigation, plumbing, or technologies lost after a flood. Maybe the unreadable writing is not a language at all, but a protective code designed to keep dangerous knowledge out of the wrong hands. That last idea is a major part of the appeal. Hidden knowledge feels more powerful than ordinary knowledge. A visible textbook can be argued with. A mysterious manuscript can contain almost anything, and the Voynich Manuscript gives the theory just enough material to work with. It has plants that do not quite identify, diagrams that do not quite resolve, bodies that do not quite behave like ordinary anatomy, a script that seems organized but remains unread. It looks at times like a book whose key has been deliberately removed. But now comes the hard part. A theory is not strengthened just because it explains the mystery. It has to explain the evidence better than the alternatives, and the physical evidence points firmly to a 15th century artifact. The vellum pages were made from animal skins around the early 1400s. Its illustrations share features with late medieval manuscript art. The zodiac section includes details familiar from European calendars and astrological traditions. The clothing, crowns, bathing motifs, pigments, page construction, and writing habits all fit a world of medieval scribes, artists, physicians, astrologers, and collectors. That does not prove every idea inside the manuscript originated in the 15th century. Medieval books constantly copied older material. Greek medical texts survived in Arabic translation, then returned to Europe in Latin versions. Egyptian, Persian, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions mixed across centuries. A manuscript could preserve ancient concepts without being an ancient artifact. But that is very different from proving it preserves pre-flood science. At the moment, there is no verified chain connecting the Voynich Manuscript to Noah, Atlantis, an antediluvian civilization, or any lost global culture. No readable passage says it came from before the flood. No identifiable illustration depicts a known vanished world. No archaeological evidence links its strange imagery to a civilization older than history. The pre-flood theory is conceivable in the broadest sense. Ideas can survive, texts can be copied, knowledge can be distorted beyond recognition, but conceivable is not confirmed. For now, the Voynich Manuscript may contain inherited traditions, fragments of older learning, or symbols whose roots reach far beyond the 15th century. Or it may be entirely a product of its own strange medieval moment. The book still refuses to tell us which. And this is where the Voinich Manuscript becomes more interesting than the pre-flood theory, not less. Because the medieval world was full of old knowledge, real old knowledge, knowledge that had crossed languages, religions, empires, wars, and centuries before it ever reached a European scribe with a quill in his hand. A 15th century manuscript did not need to be a direct survivor from some vanished civilization to contain ideas that were ancient, strange, fragmented, and almost impossible to trace. It only needed a long history. Picture a text being copied for the first time in ancient Greece. Maybe it is a guide to medicinal plants. Maybe it is an astronomical handbook. Maybe it is a collection of recipes, diagrams, and observations attributed to a famous sage. Over the next several hundred years, copies circulate. A Roman scholar translates some parts into Latin. A Byzantine monk copies it but misunderstands a plant name. An Arabic physician encounters a version in Syria, expands it with medical knowledge from Persia and India, and has it translated into Arabic. A Jewish scholar adds Hebrew notes. Centuries later, a Latin translator in Spain or Italy converts part of that Arabic version into Latin. By the time the text reaches a medieval workshop, it may barely resemble the original. Names change, images drift, words are misspelled, a diagram loses its labels. A plant that grew around the Mediterranean is copied by somebody who has never seen it. Its leaves become too broad, its flower changes color, its root turns into something decorative because the artist is working from an older, drawing not from life. Now repeat that process 10 times. That is how knowledge can become weird. Medieval manuscript culture was not like printing. There was no master file, no official edition. Every copy was also a potential mutation. A scribe could accidentally skip a line, repeat a line, merge 2 paragraphs, or replace an unfamiliar word with one that sounded similar. An illustrator could compress a detailed image into a crude symbol. Another illustrator could then copy the crude symbol as if it were accurate. Over generations, a recognizable herb can become an impossible plant. A practical astronomical chart can become a wheel of symbols. A medical diagram can become a maze of tubes, pools, stars, and naked figures whose original meaning has been partly lost. And none of that requires Atlantis. It requires scribes. The routes of transmission were enormous. Greek and Roman medical traditions remained influential for centuries, especially the writings associated with Hippocrates, Galen, Dioscares, and Pliny. But those traditions did not simply sit unchanged in European libraries. They traveled east and south. They were translated into Syriac and Arabic. They were debated, corrected, reorganized, and combined with Persian, Indian, and local medical practices. During the medieval Islamic world, scholars and physicians preserved and developed an astonishing range of material: medicine, pharmacology, astronomy, mathematics, optics, alchemy, geography, and natural history. Arabic scholars did not merely save Greek texts from disappearance. They added observations, experiments, classifications, commentaries, and whole new bodies of learning. Then much of that knowledge moved again. In places like Sicily and the Iberian Peninsula, translators worked across Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and local vernacular languages. A book might pass through Greek, Arabic, and Latin before arriving in a European monastery, university, court, or private collection. At every stage, it could gain something, and at every stage, it could lose something. That matters for the Voynich Manuscript because its imagery does not have to belong neatly to one tradition. Maybe its herbal pages draw on the visual language of European herbals, but preserve distorted plant lore with roots in Greek pharmacology, Arabic medicine, or regional folk practice. Maybe its astronomical circles combined zodiac imagery familiar in medieval Europe with older ideas about planetary influence, lunar timing, and the medical significance of the heavens. Maybe the bathing figures reflect traditions of balneology, reproduction, humoral medicine, spiritual purification, or all of those things mixed together. The manuscript could be a compilation, not a single voice from a single lost civilization, but a strange cabinet of inherited traditions. And honestly, that may be more plausible, also more difficult, because a synthetic book can look inconsistent. One section may use symbols from astrology, another may use plant imagery, another may preserve a technical recipe tradition, another may contain private shorthand, invented labels, or enciphered passages. The person who made it may have been assembling material from sources we no longer possess, translating concepts imperfectly, or deliberately hiding the connections. This was not unusual behavior in the late medieval and early Renaissance world. Scholars collected secrets, physicians guarded recipes, alchemists wrote in riddles, astrologers used symbols and technical abbreviations. Books of secrets promised hidden knowledge about stones, herbs, metals, bodies, dreams, and stars. And ancient authority was powerful. If you wanted your book to be taken seriously, you did not always say, "I made this up last Tuesday." You connected it to a revered name. Hermes, Trismegistus, Solomon, Aristotle, Galen, ancient Egyptians, Chaldans, biblical patriarchs. A claimed lineage made knowledge feel older, deeper, and more legitimate. Sometimes those attributions were genuine traditions. Sometimes they were pious guesses. Sometimes they were marketing. A medical recipe attributed to Hippocrates might be centuries later. A magical text claiming Egyptian origins could be medieval, Christian, Jewish, Arabic, Greek, or some mixture nobody could fully untangle. The point was not always historical accuracy. The point was authority. This is why the idea of an ancient source behind the Voynich Manuscript should not be dismissed automatically. Older material absolutely could lie behind a 15th century copy. Lost source texts absolutely existed. Many works are known only through later quotations, translations, or damaged descendants. Entire libraries vanished through war, fire, neglect, censorship, and simple bad luck. But a lost source is not a blank check. The fact that a text is unreadable does not mean it must be unimaginably ancient. The fact that its plants are strange does not prove extinct species. The fact that its diagrams resist interpretation does not make them advanced technology. Transmission can create mystery all by itself. A manuscript copied across centuries can preserve real knowledge, false knowledge, symbolic knowledge, and misunderstood knowledge on the same page. That may be exactly what we are looking at. Not a message transmitted intact from before history, but a document at the end of a long, tangled chain. A chain of translators, healers, artists, scribes, collectors, and secretive intellectual traditions. Each person preserving something, each person changing something, until the original, if there ever was one, becomes almost impossible to see. And once you start following that chain, certain famous names begin to appear. Names that have been attached to the Voynich Manuscript for generations. One of them was Roger Bacon, another was John Dee. And both men lived in worlds where ancient knowledge-coded books and hidden sciences were not fantasy at all. Roger Bacon was almost inevitable. If you are holding an unreadable book full of strange plants, star diagrams, bathing women, pharmaceutical recipes, and a script nobody can crack, eventually somebody is going to say the name Roger Bacon. Bacon was a 13th century English friar, philosopher, and experimenter. He wrote about optics, mathematics, languages, astronomy, alchemy, and the importance of observation. Later writers turned him into something even larger. a medieval genius who supposedly anticipated microscopes, gunpowder, flying machines, and modern science centuries before his time. Some of that reputation is deserved. Bacon was genuinely unusual for his era in the seriousness he gave to mathematics and experiment, but some of it is legend built up by generations who wanted a brilliant, almost modern scientist hiding in the Middle Ages, and that made him the perfect candidate for the Voynich Manuscript. The connection traces back to a letter written in the 17th century by Johannes Marcus Marci, a physician and scholar in Prague. Marci sent the manuscript to the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher in Rome, hoping Kircher might decipher it. Kircher was famous across Europe for attempting to decode ancient languages, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and every other mystery people could mail to him. In his letter, Marci included a remarkable story. He said the book had once belonged to Emperor Rudolf II, the Holy Roman Emperor who ruled from Prague, and who had a serious appetite for art, astrology, alchemy, rare books, mechanical marvels, and anything rumored to contain secret knowledge. According to Marci, Rudolf had bought the manuscript for 600 gold ducats, an enormous sum, and Marci added the person who had sold it to Rudolf believed it was written by Roger Bacon. That sentence changed the manuscript's mythology, not because it proved Bacon wrote it, it did not. Marci was reporting a belief held by an earlier owner, not presenting a signed declaration, a royal inventory, or a chain of custody reaching back to Bacon himself. We do not even know with certainty who sold the book to Rudolf, or whether Rudolf really paid that enormous price. But picture how powerful the story was. An unreadable manuscript, a collector emperor obsessed with hidden sciences, a price of 600 ducats, and the name of one of medieval Europe's most famous intellectuals attached to it. Once that story enters the record, it is very hard to remove. The problem is chronology. Roger Bacon died around 1292. Radiocarbon dating of the Voynich manuscript's vellum places the animal skins used for its pages roughly between 1404 and 1438. That does not tell us the exact year somebody wrote on them. Parchment could sit unused for a while, but it makes Bacon's direct authorship extremely difficult. We would need to imagine that a man dead for more than a century somehow wrote a book on material produced after his death. Could the manuscript preserve ideas attributed to Bacon? Possibly. Could it be a later copy of a Bacon text or a work placed under Bacon's prestigious name? In principle, yes. Medieval and Renaissance books were constantly attributed to famous authorities, but that is very different from saying, Roger Bacon made the object now locked away at Yale. Then there is John D. was a 16th century English mathematician, astrologer, antiquarian, court advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, and one of the most fascinating figures of the Renaissance. He owned one of the greatest private libraries in England. He studied navigation, astronomy, mathematics, and ancient history. He collected manuscripts. He was deeply interested in hidden knowledge and claimed access to angelic communications through seances conducted with his associate Edward Kelly. If the Voynich manuscript had passed through the hands of a famous Renaissance occult scholar, John Dee would be an excellent suspect, and there is a tempting historical overlap. Dee and Kelly traveled through Central Europe in the 1580s. They spent time in Bohemia, the same intellectual world that later centered on Rudolf II's Prague court. Dee also had a major interest in Roger Bacon and owned or consulted Bacon-related manuscripts. So, some researchers have proposed a dramatic possibility. Maybe Dee acquired the Voynich manuscript, decided it was Bacon's work, and sold it to Rudolf through Kelly or another intermediary. It is a great story, but right now, it is still a story. There is no surviving document that says John Dee owned the Voynich manuscript. No entry in Dee's detailed diaries identifies it. No surviving sale record connects him to Rudolph's supposed purchase. No inventory of Dee's library lists an obvious match. Edward Kelly had connections at Rudolph's court and became famous there as an alchemist, but there is no documentary evidence that he wrote, sold, or even saw this manuscript. That does not make the D theory impossible. A book can disappear from an inventory. A diary can omit something. Records can be lost. But missing evidence is not evidence that the missing link must have been D. This is the pattern that surrounds the Voinich Manuscript again and again. A genuine historical figure stands near the mystery. A real letter contains a rumor. A collector has the right interests. A gap appears in the record. And then over time, the gap fills itself with a famous name. Roger Bacon gives the manuscript medieval scientific authority. John Dee gives it Renaissance magic, royal secrets, and coded angelic language. Edward Kelly adds alchemy and court intrigue. Rudolph II supplies the imperial cabinet of curiosities. Every piece feels like it belongs, but feeling like it belongs is not the same as proving it happened. The manuscript may indeed have traveled through the strange intellectual networks of Prague, Rome, England, and Central Europe. It may have been bought, traded, misidentified, admired, and hidden long before Wilfrid Voynich found it, but the evidence becomes firm only at certain points. Beyond those points, the famous names begin to multiply, and that raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the manuscript's greatest talent is not hiding a message in its pages. Maybe it is making every generation write its own story into the silence. And that possibility leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. What if there is no silence to decode? What if the Voynich manuscript is not a lost language, a cipher, a pre-flood science manual, an encrypted herbal, or a message from some forgotten intellectual tradition? What if somebody made it up? The hoax theory has always had a certain brutal elegance. The writing cannot be read. The plants cannot be identified. The diagrams seem to promise knowledge without ever delivering it. Maybe the manuscript was designed to do exactly that. Maybe it was a 15th century object built to look profound, ancient, and impossible, while containing nothing but meaningless pseudo-writing. It would not be the first time. Medieval and Renaissance Europe had plenty of forged relics, invented chronicles, fake alchemical recipes, counterfeit antiquities, and books attributed to famous dead scholars. A mysterious manuscript could have been valuable, especially if the right buyer believed it contained secret medical knowledge, hidden astrology, or the lost work of Roger Bacon. And remember that story about Emperor Rudolph II, supposedly paying 600 gold ducats for it. Whether that price is accurate or not, the rumor itself tells us what kind of market existed. Wealthy collectors wanted objects that nobody else could possess, understand, or verify. An unreadable book could be a problem. But in the right court, it could also be a feature. If you can read it, it is just a book. If nobody can read it, maybe it is priceless. So imagine a clever maker in the early 15th century. They acquire fresh vellum, expensive but available to someone with money or access to a workshop. They invent a strange alphabet. They fill page after page with flowing lines of text. They add plants that look almost real but not quite. Zodiac figures, baths, roots, jars, circular diagrams, a giant fold-out map of something that may not exist. Then they offer it to a patron, a collector, an alchemist, or a court hungry for mysteries. It sounds possible, but possible is doing a lot of work there, because a convincing hoax of this scale would have been an extraordinary project. The manuscript contains roughly 240 surviving pages, though some are missing. The vellum alone required the skins of many animals. The pigments had to be prepared. The drawings had to be planned. And then there is the writing. Tens of thousands of glyphs arranged in lines, paragraphs, sections, and repeated patterns across the whole book. This is not somebody doodling nonsense in the margins on a rainy afternoon. A hoaxer would need patience. They would need money, materials, and probably training. They would need to maintain a visual system across hundreds of pages without accidentally turning the whole thing into obvious gibberish. And if the book was created to fool a buyer, they would also need a buyer with enough wealth, curiosity, and lack of skepticism to make the effort worthwhile. None of that makes Forey impossible. Medieval people were perfectly capable of elaborate deception. But it means the word hoax does not make the mystery disappear. It just replaces one mystery with another. Who made it? For whom? and why go to this much trouble? Money is the obvious answer. A manuscript supposedly filled with hidden science could be sold for a fortune. Patronage is another possibility. Perhaps it was made to impress a wealthy sponsor to demonstrate learning, imagination, or access to secret traditions. It could have been intellectual play, the Renaissance equivalent of constructing an impossibly complicated puzzle for fellow scholars. It could have concealed something real behind a private script. Or it could have been deliberate deception created not merely to sell, but to make its owner believe they possessed forbidden knowledge. There is also a stranger possibility. The person who made it may not have thought of it as a hoax at all. Maybe it was a private language. Maybe it was a spiritual exercise. Maybe it was an attempt to organize ideas about medicine, nature, and the cosmos in a personal symbolic system. In that case, the writing could be meaningful to its maker while remaining inaccessible to everyone else. Not a fraud, exactly. More like a locked room whose key died with the person who built it. But the manuscript does not behave quite the way simplistic nonsense should behave. The text is distributed with remarkable consistency. Certain glyphs appear more often in some positions than others. Some words cluster in particular sections. The writing has patterns that resemble natural language in some statistical tests, repeated units, word frequencies, structural regularities. The so-called herbal pages do not contain text scattered randomly around pictures. Labels tend to appear where labels should appear. The stars, bathing figures, jars, and roots all seem to belong to different, organized categories. The illustrations may be bizarre, but they are not completely chaotic. The manuscript appears to have a program, a sequence, a sense that one part connects to another. That is evidence against the easiest version of the hoax theory. One person randomly inventing symbols and drawing weird plants until the pages look mysterious enough. But then the evidence twists again. Modern analysis has found features that remain deeply anomalous. Voynich has repetitions that can seem too regular for ordinary language. Similar words often appear near each other in ways that some researchers find suspicious. The vocabulary shifts between sections, but not always in ways that clearly match known languages or known ciphers. Some textual patterns can be generated by simple mechanical methods, as if a scribe were modifying existing word shapes according to rules instead of writing sentences with normal meaning. That does not prove it is meaningless. A language can have repetition. A cipher can produce strange distribution patterns. A specialized text can reuse technical vocabulary. And a writing system designed around abbreviations, syllables, or templates might look unlike anything we expect. But it does mean the manuscript has never fit comfortably into any single category. Not clear language, not clear cipher, not clear nonsense, and not clear forgery. The failure to read the Voynich Manuscript is not proof that it is fake. If it were, every undeciphered script in history would automatically become a hoax the moment scholars got stuck. That is not how evidence works. We have to ask what the object is, how it was made, whether its contents show internal structure, and whether the proposed explanation accounts for all of it. A hoax remains possible, maybe even plausible in some form, but it is not proven. And that is where the mystery becomes almost modern. Because today, the people trying to break the Voynich Manuscript are no longer relying only on intuition, rumor, or famous names. They are feeding its strange words into computers, statistical models, and artificial intelligence, asking a question that would have sounded like magic to Rudolph II. Is there a message hiding in the patterns, or have the patterns been hiding the absence of one all along? That question has pulled in some of the sharpest coder ears of the modern age. Not just amateur puzzle solvers, not just people with a theory and an internet connection. Professional cryptographers, linguists, historians, computer scientists, and researchers with experience breaking real military codes have all taken a turn at the Voynich Manuscript, and they have all discovered the same thing. This book does not give up its secrets easily. One of the most important names is William Freridman, the American Crip often called the father of modern U.S. cryptography. During both World Wars, Friedman helped develop methods for attacking enemy codes. He worked on systems where lives, military campaigns, and entire nations depended on finding structure inside apparent chaos. After the war, he became fascinated by the Voinich Manuscript. Friedman gathered a small group of skilled cryptanalysts and studied the text for years. They counted symbols. They compared repeated words. They tested the possibility of substitution ciphers, code systems, and hidden alphabets. They looked for the fingerprints that ordinary encryption tends to leave behind. Eventually, Friedman's team reached a frustrating conclusion. The manuscript did not appear to be written in a simple cipher, not a straightforward system where one strange symbol stands for one ordinary letter. Not the kind of thing you can solve by finding the most common character and guessing it means E, but that was not a solution. It was only another locked door, because if Vina is not a simple cipher, then what is it? A more complex cipher, a real language written in an unknown script, a compressed shorthand, a codebook system, a constructed language, or carefully generated nonsense. By the late 20th century, computers changed the hunt completely. Before computers, researchers could spend months counting word patterns by hand. Now, a digitized transcription could be searched in seconds. Every repeated sequence could be mapped. Every glyph could be counted. Researchers could ask whether words change depending on where they appear in a line, whether vocabulary shifts from the herbal pages to the astronomical diagrams, or whether particular word forms cluster around particular illustrations, and some results were genuinely intriguing. Voinich is not distributed like random typing. Certain symbols tend to occur at the beginnings or ends of words. Some words are common, while others appear only once or twice. Different manuscript sections seem to have different vocabularies. There are also signs that more than one scribe may have written the text based on variations in handwriting and glyph use. That last point matters. If the manuscript were produced by one person improvising meaningless text, then multiple writing habits and structured vocabulary shifts become harder to explain. Not impossible, but harder. Computers have also revealed the manuscript's strangest feature. Its words often resemble their neighbors almost too closely. A word may appear followed nearby by another word, differing by one glyph, then another and another. It can look less like ordinary writing and more like someone systematically altering a template. Imagine writing medicine, then medicines, then medicinal, then medication over and over. But according to rules nobody else understands. That pattern could reflect grammar. It could reflect prefixes, suffixes, abbreviations, or a language built from repeated syllables. It could reflect an encryption system that changes words mechanically. Or it could support the argument that the text was generated by a procedure designed to imitate language without actually saying anything. The computer can show us the pattern. It cannot tell us what the pattern means. And that brings us to artificial intelligence. AI can compare the structure of Voinich with thousands of known languages. It can test whether word lengths resemble Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, Natal, or medieval European shorthand. It can search for statistical similarities humans would never notice. It can propose likely categories, identify recurring textual formulas, and model possible relationships between glyphs. That sounds like the breakthrough everyone has been waiting for. But there is a problem. Artificial intelligence learns from examples. It works best when there is a known language, a known cipher family, a bilingual text, or at least enough securely understood material to anchor its guesses. The Voinich Manuscript offers none of those things. There is no Rosetta Stone, no translation written beside the text, no confirmed proper name, no sentence that everyone agrees says, "This is a plant," or "Mix this with water." Without an anchor, an AI can produce something that looks like a translation, while merely forcing the manuscript into a pattern it already expects. It can find resemblance. It cannot conjure a missing key out of thin air. That warning matters because the Voinich Manuscript has attracted spectacular decipherment claims for more than a century. In 1919, William Romold argued that tiny marks in the letters concealed microscopic shorthand written by Roger Bacon. The claim made headlines. Then scholars showed that the supposed hidden marks were largely cracks, ink artifacts, and overinterpretation. More recently, people have claimed the manuscript is written in Proto-Romans, abbreviated Latin, Hebrew anagrams, a medieval medical code, Aztec, Turkish, Ukrainian, and almost every other language imaginable. Some claims begin with a real observation. A plant might resemble a known species. A glyph sequence might plausibly match a name. A diagram might suggest a familiar medical or astrological tradition. Then comes the hard part. Can the method read the next page? Can it read every page? Can another researcher apply the same rules and get the same result without changing the rules whenever the translation stops making sense? That is where most claims collapse. A real solution would not just identify 3 words beside a drawing, it would explain the entire writing system. It would account for the grammar, the repetitions, the strange word forms, the section-by-section vocabulary, and the apparent scribal variations. It would produce readable passages consistently, including passages chosen by other scholars, not just the convenient examples selected by the person making the claim. And the method would have to be transparent. Show the alphabet, show the rules, show the transcription, show every step from Voynich glyph to proposed meaning. Let skeptics test it, let linguists challenge it, let cryptographers try to break it. Let historians ask whether the resulting text makes sense in a 15th century manuscript. Because mystery is not evidence, and neither is a translation that only works when nobody checks it. Digital access has made that scrutiny possible on a scale earlier generations could never imagine. High-resolution scans are available to anyone with an internet connection. Scholars can inspect pigment, pen strokes, corrections, and damaged pages without traveling to Yale's Bicky library. Volunteers can build transcriptions, linguists can share datasets, programmers can publish code and test each other's models. But the same access has also unleashed a flood of speculation. Every strange plant becomes proof of a lost continent. Every circular diagram becomes a star map from another civilization. Every AI-generated similarity becomes confirmation that the book is ancient Hebrew alien biology, or, yes, a pre-flood science manual. The internet has democratized the mystery. It has not solved it. Still, there is something almost fitting about that. 500 years after the manuscript was made, its pages are no longer locked in a private collector's cabinet. Millions of people can examine them. Machines can count every symbol. Algorithms can search every pattern. And yet the book remains silent. Or perhaps not silent. Perhaps we are still learning how to ask it the right question. So what would it actually take to say the Voynich manuscript has been solved, not guessed at, not loosely associated with a familiar language, not translated in a way that sounds convincing for 3 sentences and then dissolves into fog? Solved. The first requirement is simple and brutally difficult. A real solution has to work consistently. If a researcher says this glyph means A, it should mean A everywhere. The same rule applies. If a word is supposed to mean plant, it cannot suddenly mean castle, blood, or the King of France, because the next paragraph becomes inconvenient. If the script uses a cipher, then the cipher rules have to be clear enough for someone else to take a page at random and reproduce the reading. That is the difference between decipherment and storytelling. Anyone can look at a strange word beside a drawing of a root and decide it probably says the name of the root. Then find another word near a woman in a bath and decide it means water, health, womb, or medicine. With enough flexibility, almost any unknown text can be made to say almost anything, but that is not how real codering works. Imagine someone claimed to have deciphered ancient Egyptian because they recognized one bird symbol and decided it meant sun. That would prove almost nothing. A language is not a collection of isolated labels attached to pictures. It has grammar, repeated patterns, word order, rules for names, actions, objects, endings, and exceptions. The system has to keep working even when there are no helpful pictures nearby. And the Voinich Manuscript has plenty of pages where the pictures are not helpful at all. The herbal section may contain plants or plants assembled from familiar and unfamiliar parts. The astronomical pages may show zodiac signs, stars or diagrams adapted from medieval traditions. The biological section contains those famous women, tubes, pools, and strange green structures. Then come jars, roots, labels, recipes, and pages of text with almost nothing to guide us. A genuine reading would need to cross all of those boundaries. It would need to explain why certain words occur mostly in the herbal pages, while others cluster around the circular diagrams. It would need to account for the short labels beside illustrations and the longer blocks of prose. If the book is a medical manual, then its vocabulary should behave like medical vocabulary. If it is an astronomical text, then the diagrams and text should align with some identifiable system of dates, stars, planets, or zodiac signs. Not necessarily in the way we expect. Medieval knowledge could be strange. It could be translated from another tradition. It could be encoded, abbreviated, copied badly, or mixed with folklore. But it cannot simply be whatever a theory needs it to be on each page. A real solution also has to make predictions. This is where most proposed decipherments fail the test. A researcher should be able to publish the rules before interpreting a new passage. Then another scholar should choose a page, perhaps one with no illustrations, and apply those same rules. If both people arrive at broadly the same text with the same grammar and meanings, then something important has happened. Better still, the solution should reveal details nobody had noticed before. Maybe it predicts that a recurring word means root, and the word turns up mostly beside root drawings. Maybe it identifies a sequence as a month name, then correctly explains why it appears in a zodiac diagram. Maybe it reveals that two distant pages describe the same recipe in slightly different forms. A successful decipherment should not just explain old mysteries, it should generate new testable insights. Then comes the strongest kind of evidence, external corroboration. The ideal discovery would be a key. A letter from the 15th or 16th century saying, "I wrote this book in this script." A notebook containing the same alphabet beside ordinary Latin, German, Italian, Hebrew, or another known language. A second manuscript with parallel text, a cipher table, a marginal note naming an author, patron, translator, or place, even a newly identified source. For one of the illustrations could narrow the possibilities dramatically. Think about why the Rosetta Stone mattered. It did not solve Egyptian because someone stared at it harder than everyone else. It gave scholars the same official text in Greek and Egyptian scripts. That external anchor turned speculation into a method. The Voinich Manuscript has no such anchor, at least none that has been securely identified. But archives still hold millions of uncatalogued pages. Private collections still contain material scholars have not studied. A forgotten inventory, a damaged book of cipher alphabets, or a correspondence file connected to one of the manuscript's early owners could change the investigation overnight. Science may help too. Improved ink analysis could clarify whether different hands use different materials. Multispectral imaging might reveal faded corrections, erased notes, or details hidden beneath damage. Better comparisons with medieval scribal practices could tell us whether its strange letter forms belong to a lost shorthand tradition rather than a wholly invented script. And future AI tools may become more useful, not because they magically translate the book, but because they can test thousands of historical possibilities faster and more carefully than any human team. But even then, the standard cannot change. A solution must be reproducible, it must be transparent, it must survive hostile scrutiny, and until that happens, the Voynich manuscript remains unread. That does not mean it is meaningless. We already know it is a real 15th century artifact made from parchment, written by human hands, organized with extraordinary care, and passed through centuries of collectors, scholars, and obsessives. Its plants may be impossible, its script may be opaque, Its diagrams may lead nowhere we recognize. But the book itself is evidence of something real, a mind, or perhaps several minds trying to preserve, conceal, invent, or transform knowledge. Maybe it is a cipher waiting for its key. Maybe it is a language whose relatives vanished. Maybe it is an elaborate hoax so sophisticated that it has outlived everyone who understood the joke. Or maybe the most unsettling possibility is the simplest one. The manuscript was made to be read, just not by us. And maybe that is where the real mystery begins. Because after more than a century of serious study, the strongest facts about the Voynich Manuscript are also the strangest ones. It is real. The parchment has been radiocarbon dated to the early 15th century, most likely between 1404 and 1438. The book was not printed in a modern basement. It was not assembled from plastic paper and fake ink by someone trying to fool 20th century scholars. It is a genuine medieval object made with costly materials, written carefully by hand, illustrated page after page, and bound into a manuscript that clearly required time, planning, skill, and money. Someone wanted this book to exist, and whoever made it filled it with writing that still cannot be read, not because nobody has tried. Professional cryptographers have tried, linguists have tried, medieval historians, botanists, statisticians, codebreakers, computer scientists, amateur sleuths, and now artificial intelligence systems have all taken their shot. Some have found patterns, some have proposed languages, some have claimed total solutions, but no explanation has yet cleared the one obstacle that matters most. Nobody can reliably read a random page and prove what it says. That leaves us with possibilities, real possibilities, but possibilities. Maybe Voynich is a natural language, written in an unknown or heavily altered script. Perhaps it records a regional dialect that was never widely preserved, mixed with abbreviations, scribal conventions, and technical vocabulary we no longer understand. Maybe it is a cipher, not necessarily a spy code in the modern sense, but a method for hiding medical, astrological, alchemical, religious, or political knowledge from uninitiated readers. Medieval Europe was full of secret alphabets, shorthand systems, coded recipes, and texts designed to reveal themselves only to the right audience. Maybe it is a constructed language, a deliberate intellectual experiment, an attempt by one author or a small circle to create a new system for organizing the world. Or maybe it is a hoax. That possibility cannot be dismissed completely. The strange plants, strange women, strange diagrams, and strange script could be an elaborate performance. But if it was a hoax, it was an astonishingly labor-intensive one. Someone used expensive parchment, wrote tens of thousands of carefully patented characters, maintained apparent rules across hundreds of pages, and created illustrations with enough resemblance to real medieval traditions to keep scholars arguing for generations. That would not be impossible, but it would mean the hoax itself is one of the most remarkable creations of the 15th century. And then there is the most dramatic theory of all. What if this is not merely a medieval book? What if it is a copy of something much older? A fragment of lost science passed through unknown hands, preserving ideas from a civilization erased by catastrophe. The so-called pre-flood science manual theory imagines that its impossible plants, unfamiliar diagrams, and unreadable writing are not inventions at all. They are distorted echoes of a world before some great collapse, knowledge surviving as copies of copies, misunderstood by later scribes, but preserved because somebody believed it mattered. It is an incredible idea, but incredible is not the same as proven. There is no secure evidence that the Voynich manuscript comes from a civilization before recorded history. No demonstrated connection to Atlantis, a global flood, an advanced vanished culture, or a scientific tradition older than the medieval world. The manuscript we possess is a 15th century artifact. That is where the evidence stands. Still, that does not make the question worthless, because even if the book is entirely medieval, it may preserve a lost way of thinking, a system of medicine, astronomy, body, religion, or symbolism that does not fit neatly into the categories we use today. Maybe the manuscript hides a message, or maybe it does something stranger. Maybe its deepest mystery is not what individual words mean, but how its creator organized knowledge itself. Plants that are not quite plants, stars that are not quite astronomy, baths that may be anatomy, medicine, ritual, or metaphor. Pages that look familiar enough to tempt us, then become alien the moment we try to understand them. We all want a final answer. We want someone to lift up a translation and say, "This is what the manuscript was telling us from the beginning." But sometimes uncertainty is more truthful than certainty. A weak explanation gives us the satisfaction of closure. A genuine mystery makes us continue searching, continue questioning, and continue separating solid evidence from speculation. And perhaps that is exactly why the Voynich Manuscript has remained so fascinating for so long. It reminds us that history was never created as a puzzle waiting for us to complete it. Sometimes the past is more like a sealed room, and the only thing we can do is carefully examine the door. So what do you believe? Is the Voynich Manuscript an encrypted medical text, a forgotten language, an elaborate medieval deception, an experimental work, or a damaged record of knowledge inherited from a far older world? Share your theory in the comments and tell us where you are listening from.